Kakim Iskakovich Karetinov recalled that after the death of Captain Korolev's battalion on April 30, 1984, he was assigned a difficult task. His platoon was engaged in installing electronic tracking devices around villages and roads to monitor the movements of the insurgents. The work was hard and dangerous, but familiar. Then one day in early June, Brigade Commander Putin summoned him and assigned him to take up a combat guard post codenamed Dragon's Tooth. Karetinov was about to take his platoon, but the company commander, Captain Sakov, stopped him. "Don't touch your own soldiers, you'll go with strangers. You'll endure a week or two, and then you'll be back." He didn't argue, even though his heart told him that a couple of weeks in Afghanistan often turned into months. And that's how it turned out. Instead of 2 weeks, the assignment at Dragon's Tooth stretched out to 2.5 months. On the day of departure, he was assigned 10 fighters led by a sergeant. The order was clear: check everyone's equipment, take the maximum amount of ammunition, an RS-7 radio with spare batteries, rations for 3 days, a supply of water, and most importantly, cigarettes, without which many could not imagine life. They set off on the morning of June 9th, at about 10 o'clock. They made their first stop on the outskirts of the village by a small river. They had lunch, adjusted their equipment, and headed for the mountains. The road proved to be difficult. One soldier constantly lagged behind, for which he received a harsh barracks talk from Karetinov and picked up the pace, but the general fatigue of the platoon was obvious. Twilight caught them on the ascent, and there were only 200 or 300 meters left to the post. They decided to spend the night right in the mountains, as they had no strength to move on. They only reached their position in the morning. There they were met by 2 sappers. One was wounded and had his bandages changed. They gestured to show the boundaries of the minefields, warned them about dangerous places, and went downhill. Now it was their territory. Work began on equipping the camp. Everything was done in a hurry. They dug trenches, reinforced positions, and stretched tarps. On the territory of the post, they found an old enemy dugout, dirty, cramped, but still suitable for storing things. There was also a bag of flour, some junk, and the remains of dry rations. I distributed the forces at the post as experience dictated. There were 3 main observation and duty points. In the center of the post, closer to the dugout, I myself was in charge of control and coordination. I placed 3 fighters at the second point, where the radio station was located. Dima, a strong and diligent guy, but completely new to Afghanistan, was responsible for communications. Next to him was Oleg, and the same soldier who had been lagging behind the whole time on the way up, and for which he had already received a stern talking to from me. I understood that he was the weakest link, so I kept him close to the more reliable guys. Before starting our shift, I explained to each of them in detail what to do and how to do it, telling them what I knew myself and what I had heard from other veteran soldiers. During my 6 months in Afghanistan, I managed to get into all sorts of trouble. I escorted convoys from Kabul to Kyrgyzstan, came under fire, and saw people die because of stupidity or carelessness. So I tried to teach the soldiers right away what is most valued here: discipline, caution, and the ability to remain calm even in the most difficult conditions. The service went on as usual, but literally within the first couple of days, we received a whole bunch of valuable instructions from the command, which were of little use. Instead, real problems came one after another. Almost immediately, we ran out of water. The heat in the mountains was exhausting, and no one brought us tanks of drinking water. After the water, the cigarettes disappeared. To calm their nerves, the soldiers began collecting cigarette butts, smoking filters, and stuffing homemade cigarettes made of newspaper. Then it was the turn of the dry rations. Everything we had quickly ran out. We even silently thanked the spirits for the crumbs of flour and some food supplies they had left behind in the old dugout, which they had not had time to take with them. But the worst thing happened when the radio station's batteries ran out. Communication with the command was only possible when strictly necessary, and even then only intermittently. For several days, we were literally surviving until our regiment's reconnaissance company went on a combat operation in the mountains. Their route passed through the territory of our post. I begged and demanded that the company commander, Captain Grimchak, bring us water and new batteries. In the end, they brought us 2 RDV, 12 rubber water backpacks and a spare battery for the radio station. That was all. We never got any cigarettes. Grimchak himself did not smoke and did not even try to get tobacco for us. At first, it seemed like some relief, but the joy was short-lived. We still didn't have enough water, so we saved every last drop. There were no cigarettes at all. People were starting to get nervous, and it's at times like these that the wildest ideas pop into your head. Two of my fighters, Kazyanov and Gerasimovich, decided to show some initiative while I was resting during the day. Not only did they explore the area around the post, but out of curiosity they ventured into the minefields that the sappers had shown us. When it became clear that Kazyanov and Gerasimovich had ventured into the minefields, Kazyanov was showered with strong words not only from me, but from all the soldiers whose lives he had nearly endangered. That's when he got the nickname, Chemist. The irony of fate was that the nickname turned out to be very apt. I later learned that in civilian life, Dima had indeed studied chemistry at some university. His partner, Oleg Gerasimovich, was from the western regions of Ukraine, a smart guy, but sometimes too curious, which in Afghanistan was considered a deadly flaw. I personally distributed water to the soldiers, realizing that it was the most valuable resource at the post. The ration was strict, 1 cup 3 times a day. We used these cups directly from the Army's 1941 model aluminum flasks. Those who served remember, the flask held 1 liter 400 grams, and its lid was just the right size for a cup. We drank from these lids. The water was poured carefully, without a single drop wasted. Every sip counted. That was when I first realized the true value of water. After a couple of weeks without normal water, I began to feel like I was losing my mind. At night, I dreamed of waterfalls, noisy and transparent, as if mocking me. I woke up covered in sweat, my mouth parched. But the worst thing was that over time, I began to see waterfalls even during the day, in the glint of stones, in mirages, in sunbeams. With each passing day, the line between reality and hallucinations became increasingly blurred. And then a miracle happened. Chemist and Gerasimovich, violating a direct order and risking a court-martial, found water, a spring just 20 minutes' walk from the post. They did this during my rest shift, without consulting me. But thanks to their initiative, our entire garrison survived. Of course, I reprimanded them for violating orders, but deep down I understood that it was this initiative that saved our lives. At night, I stayed awake myself, walking around the posts and checking on the guards. Sometimes I found the guards dozing off at their posts. At first, I punished them by depriving them of water. I had no other means of influence. But when I saw other soldiers sharing their last water with their punished comrades, I realized that this punishment only destroyed morale. So I stopped practicing such measures. Later, remembering this, I shuddered more than once. Water was more valuable than gold, but then, out of inexperience, I almost broke the guys. One day, a reconnaissance company of the regiment under the command of Captain Grinchak passed through our post. They stayed with us for the night. In the evening, I got talking to one of the scouts, a thin guy of about 20. He turned out to have been a participant in that very battle of the 1st Battalion in the Khazara Gorge, where almost the entire unit was killed in the mountains. There were many rumors about this battle. It was discussed in every unit where Afghans served. Some heard one thing, some heard another, but everyone understood that it was a tragedy that shook everyone. Even Karetanov recalled that after the death of Captain Korolev's battalion, the soldiers returned to this topic again and again. They discussed both the battle itself and the rumors surrounding it, because this story had become almost legendary, but a terrible and bloody legend that left its mark on everyone who had even heard a rumor about the Khazara Gorge. In real life, it was the same. One eyewitness would tell something, another would make his own corrections, and the conversations would flare up again and again. And now, at our second stop, there was a living witness to those events. How could we not listen? After dinner, when everyone had caught their breath from the dust of the day, recovered a little, and settled down, this soldier began to tell his story. And what in civilian life would seem like a terrible fairy tale, about miracle warriors and enemies who seemed to have come down from the pages of epic poems, here in Afghanistan was perceived quite differently. You understood that if you made a couple of mistakes, it would no longer be someone else's story, but your own death. The bullets would not fly at the nameless heroes of years past, but at you personally, at Shabanov, Gerasimovich, or Varla, at any one of us. The soldiers listened attentively, silently, even their breathing seemed quieter than usual. Because this was not an abstract lecture, not military propaganda, but the voice of a man who had gone through hell himself. His story was like a reminder. You can't relax here, every little thing determines whether you stay alive. I first heard about this battle myself in Bugram. Our company commander, Ryazanov, lined us up on the parade ground and, without unnecessary emotion, in a dry military manner, informed us that the 1st Battalion had been ambushed in the Kazara Gorge. They were walking along the bottom of the gorge, without cover from above. This was categorically unacceptable. Everyone knew it, even the newbies, but for some reason, that was the decision that was made. The enemy, of course, did not miss this opportunity. They knew the terrain well and had prepared positions in advance on the dominant heights, where they had dug covered firing points and camouflaged machine gun nests. Our troops fell right into a classic fire trap. The battalion found itself under crossfire from above and from the flanks. The conditions of the battle were extremely unfavorable. A narrow gorge, almost no cover, rocks, and cliffs. From the very beginning, it was clear that the battle would be bloody. Casualties began immediately. At first, they announced 56 killed and 86 wounded, and only 12 people from the entire battalion were able to leave Khazar on their own feet. Later, in official documents, the figures were clarified: 59 dead and 105 wounded. And if we add the 3 who died later from their wounds in hospitals, the total coincided completely with the first report. Such discrepancies in the figures are quite understandable. In the first hours and days after the battle, some of the wounded had not yet been taken to hospitals, some held on until the last moment and did not seek help, and some were simply not counted in the heat of battle. And so, the soldier we spoke to at Dragon's Tooth recalled this hell while I was away from my post and then returned. He spoke as if he were reliving it all over again. The battalion moved through the gorge, walked several hundred meters, then split into 2 columns. One went along one bank of the river, the other along the other. It seemed that this would be safer, but it was precisely this decision that proved fatal. The head of the column, in which our scout was walking, climbed a gentle cape, which the soldiers themselves called the Dog. And at that very moment, the enemy opened heavy fire. At first, they fired small arms, machine guns and rifles. Almost immediately, several large-caliber machine guns set up in ambush joined in. The first bursts were aimed at officers and signalmen. The enemy knew that if they took out the commanders and deprived the battalion of communication, the soldiers would be demoralized and unable to control the battle. But that was not the end of it. The machine guns were followed by explosions, grenade launchers, mortars, and perhaps even homemade grenades thrown from above by the militants. To the soldiers below, it looked like a continuous rain of fire and metal. Explosions echoed and whistled through the gorge, dust rose in columns, and rocks fell from the cliffs. In this chaos, many fell, some immediately motionless, others writhing in pain from their wounds. The narrator himself was shot in the back. The impact was so strong that he fell face down on the rocks. Everything around him seemed to go dark, only the ringing in his ears and darkness remained. He lost consciousness. The soldier was saved from certain death by a real accident, a bag of ammunition. To lighten his load, the guy had cut a piece of fabric from his old pants back at the camp, sewn it into a bag, and filled it with ammunition, adding a couple of cans of stew. When an enemy bullet hit him, it tore open the bag, pierced the cans of stew, and, getting stuck in the ammunition, did not penetrate deep into his body. He himself received only a severe blow to the back and was thrown face down onto the rocky path. His spine miraculously survived, but he was so stunned that for a few seconds he could not understand whether he was alive or dead. At that moment, enemy snipers and machine gunners methodically finished off those who were lying on the path and still showing signs of life. They shot at anyone who moved, even those who were just trying to lift their heads. It seemed that the outcome of the battle was already decided. But the surviving Soviet soldiers managed to gather themselves and give the enemy a fierce rebuff. They understood that surrendering meant dying in agony. The grenade launchers, risking their lives, deployed their AGSs right in the open. Under the deafening crack of gunfire, they showered the enemy positions with heavy fire, destroying one stronghold after another. Our narrator described in particular detail a junior sergeant from the AGS unit who did not run, did not flinch, and did not hide. He continued to fire at the enemy until the end, throwing fragmentation grenades directly into machine gun nests and groups of militants. And even when an enemy bullet struck him in the back of the head, he leaned his chest against his grenade launcher and remained in position, dead, but fighting to the last. The narrator recalled other episodes as well. The wounded, realizing that they were about to be finished off, jumped into the river, hoping to swim across or at least go underwater and save themselves. One mortar gunner, who miraculously survived the chaos of battle, took cover behind the base plate of his own mortar and kept firing until he ran out of shells. But the soldiers of the Afghan army, who were formerly fighting side by side with the Soviet battalion, defected to the enemy in the heat of battle. Their betrayal was a blow that further exacerbated the already desperate situation of the fighters. Our witness recounted all this with such intensity and passion that it made our hair stand on end. It seemed that he was not narrating, but reliving everything, with pauses, heavy breathing, and details that could not be invented. Then he suddenly fell silent, lay down on his sheet in the platoon tent, and instantly fell asleep, as if he had spoken his mind and freed himself from this burden. In the morning, he got up, gathered his simple belongings, and moved on with the reconnaissance unit, heading into the mountains, leaving Dragon's Tooth and us behind. I remained sitting and thinking, how could this be? After such a battle, after such losses, after that hell in the Khazar Gorge, the boys were not taken out, not transferred, not protected, but left to fight again. The Soviet Union had always been proud of its industry, the might of its army, its nuclear shield, and its global influence. Columns of tanks marched in parades across Red Square, the Air Force demonstrated its aerobatic skills, and the newspapers wrote about the invincible and legendary. But behind all this facade were guys just like our narrator, who were simply left where they were, without the right to a break, without psychological help, without rehabilitation. After the Vietnam War, the Americans developed a system of psychological support for soldiers. Even then, they understood that post-traumatic stress disorder could ruin a person's life. In our country, it was believed that Soviet soldiers are psychologically stable, and that was that. Even if his comrades died before his eyes, even if he himself miraculously survived the hell of battle, he was only offered to fall in line and continue his service. And this kid, who went through Khazara, instead of breaking down, wrote a report and asked to be transferred to the reconnaissance unit. He said, "Did the enemy think they would get away with it? No way. I will avenge my fallen brothers with my own hands." And it wasn't a pose, it wasn't bravado, it was his way of coping with the pain, his personal form of psychological defense. But along with his determination, he left us with his bullet in our heads, a thought that rusted inside each of us for a long time. How could this be? How could such a massacre be allowed to happen? Who was to blame for the 1st Battalion ending up in a fire trap? Why were they sent there without cover? We turned these thoughts over and over in our minds, trying to push them away, but they kept coming back. The Army is a huge system, with its headquarters, plans, services, and orders. But if soldiers are performing heroic deeds on the front lines, it means that somewhere else, someone has failed to fulfill their duties. Everyone knew this simple rule. A heroic deed is always the flip side of someone's mistake, someone's betrayal, or someone's negligence. Who should I ask? The commander of the reconnaissance company, Captain Grinchak? But on April 30th, he himself was near Khazara and was the first to come to the battalion's rescue. He saw the consequences with his own eyes. He was an eyewitness. Who am I that he, a real scout who had been through Khazara, would tell me everything straight? To him, I could be anyone, an informer, a disguised enemy, or just a chatty youngster who shouldn't know too much. A scout would never share the truth with someone who is unknown to him. In their world, unnecessary words are too costly. And then it occurred to me, what if I tried talking not to him, but to Starcev? To Starcev, I was not an abstract soldier from the neighboring company, but a very specific person, with my own name, surname, and my own list of deeds, some stupid, some quite normal. To Starsov, I was one of his own. He saw how I fought, how I carried out orders, how I made mistakes and how I corrected them. That meant I could seem like a reliable interlocutor to him. Moreover, Starsov was the first of our company to enter Panjshir. He was there, in the very place where one of the bloodiest and most talked about tragedies unfolded, in the Khazara Gorge on May 1st. And he definitely saw everything with his own eyes. But fate decreed that while we were preparing in Bagram for the march to Panjshir, Senior Lieutenant Ahmed Aliyev, our company commander, was shot right in the heart. Vanya Grek took him to the hospital, and Starsov was temporarily put in charge of the platoon in his place. And so it happened that he went into the mountains with the 9th Company, while our 7th Company was left in Bagram. I made a firm decision. As soon as I had the opportunity, I would ask Starsov about it. I was sure that he knew the truth about Khazar. And not some retold story, but what he had seen with his own eyes. Of course, I understood that this conversation would not be easy. Frontline soldiers do not like to remember such things, and even more so, they do not like to share them with everyone. But it was important to me. I wanted to get to the bottom of it. How could it happen that an entire battalion was set up, that the boys were driven into a fire trap, and on top of that, it was all dismissed as a combat mission and heavy but inevitable losses? I made a firm decision. I would get to the bottom of the story of the 1st Battalion in Khazar. Sergeant Bazrukov, as usual, got up at dawn, when the sun had just risen over the rocky ridge and began to dispel the cold of the night with its merciless heat. He was dressed in attire that was unusual for a combat post: green army pants, long since worn out, and hospital slippers, which had somehow found their way to Dragon's Tooth and become part of his everyday equipment. The uniform was clearly not regulation, but who in these mountains paid attention to such trifles? The main thing was that he had his rifle on his shoulder and was ready to carry out orders. Before going to report, he carefully smoothed out his trouser legs with his palms, as if trying to give himself an air of severity, and adjusted his belt so that his Kalashnikov would sit more comfortably. He held his rifle confidently, although it was clear to everyone that reporting was not a combat operation, but merely part of the routine. But in Afghanistan, any little thing could turn into a surprise, and therefore even the journey from point 1 to point 2 seemed important and significant. Bazrukov moved along the rock wall. Gravel crunched under his feet, dust rose in light clouds, and the heated stones already gave off a noticeable heat. It seemed like an ordinary crossing, one of hundreds he had made, but each time he was left with the feeling, what if something unexpected happens today? In the mountains, you couldn't be sure of anything. His task was formal: to report to the commandant that no incidents had occurred during his shift. No shelling, no attempts to break through, no emergencies. As he joked to himself, not 100 liters of water fell from the sky. But rules are rules. If something happened, you had to report it. If nothing happened, you had to report that too. And the main question always remained: if something did happen, it would be necessary to determine where, when, and who was to blame. So, in broad daylight, on a hot June afternoon, Sergeant Bazrukov left point number 1 and headed for point number 2 to report to the commander of Dragon's Tooth. It seemed like an ordinary, unremarkable official step. Bazrukov stepped onto the path looking as handsome and well-groomed as if he were going to a parade. His black hair was neatly trimmed and slicked back, his face was clean-shaven, a real Eastern beauty, ready to star in a movie. He took a dozen steps along the long gray rock wall, the sun shining in his eyes, his automatic rifle held confidently in his hands. The hospital slippers he was wearing were his weak point. They were uncomfortable to walk on rocks in, each step feeling like walking on hot coals. And then fate decided to play a cruel joke. As soon as he stopped, stepping on a protruding rock with his slipper, a bullet screeched into the rock next to him. One more step and that piece of lead would have gone straight into his chest. The rock shook, the bullet flattened and fell down onto the path, leaving a noticeable gray mark on the rock. His ears rang with surprise. Bazrukov, who had been so confident just a moment ago, suddenly became haggard, turned pale, and, as if he had aged in a single heartbeat, walked on toward the commandant, no longer as cheerfully as before. When he reached the entrance to the SPS, he crouched down, his hands shaking, the hair on his temples turning gray, as if he had turned from a young man into an old man in 5 minutes. Karetanov looked at him and, smiling, said, "Don't be afraid. Where are the enemies here? Who would want to shoot you?" Bazrukov said nothing, only opened his palm, and there lay a flattened lead ball, a silvery disc, evidence that death had passed within a centimeter. "Here's a talisman for you," added Karetanov. "Drill a hole in it at home, thread a chain through it, and wear it as an amulet. Now no one will touch you until you die." Everyone looked at each other. Maybe fate had indeed marked this guy, saved him from death. I caught myself thinking, what kind of weapon could it have been? The bullet looked ancient, old, as if it had flown out of a rifle from my great-grandfather's time. Did someone bring a karamultu here? I had seen such things in the mountains, ancient hunting weapons that the Dushanbe had passed down from generation to generation. At first, I thought that such a rifle could only be used to fight with, not to wage war. But here it was, almost killing our D-mob. And on that day, it gradually dawned on us that this was no joke. We took our binoculars and began scanning our firing sectors with their enlightened optics. We turned them for a long time, poring over every shadow, every rock. And then, Sergei Gubin rushed like a bullet to our ensign. A minute later, he was running toward us, toward Gerasimovich and me, stumbling with excitement. He grabbed the binoculars, pointed in one direction, and shouted, "Look, there's some scum wandering around. I'm sure it was him who ruined Bazrukov's haircut before discharge. Let's eliminate him." And at the same time, he proudly shows off his sniper rifle, a rifle with a heroic inscription on the butt, which he called "My Bride." Of course, you can't eliminate someone like that without orders from above. You need official permission to open fire. And where can you get it? You have to go to the ensign and beg for it. This is where Gerasimovich's cunning came into play. He instantly realized that he himself would not risk getting shot, and quickly put forward my candidacy. "Let him go, he's our negotiator." Well, there was nowhere to go, so I went. I approached Karetanov and explained insinuatingly, "We've been stuck on Dragon's Tooth for almost 2 weeks now, our weapons are covered in dust, we've cleaned them as best we can, but we need to test fire them to make sure there are no misfires later. 12 days without sighting in our weapons is not right, Comrade Commandant." Karetanov looked exhausted. His shift had just begun, and he could barely stand on his feet. And at that moment, instead of becoming alarmed, he waved his hand. "All right, sight in your weapons. But don't do anything on your own initiative." That's just what we were waiting for. 10 minutes later, our tooth was already rumbling as if a whole operation had begun. We fired everything we had at our disposal. The roar echoed through the gorge, and it seemed as if we were really fighting an invisible enemy. Of course, such freedom could not last long. No sooner had we dispersed than a voice bellowed over the radio, demanding that Karetanov report in. "Comrade Ensign, what is going on there? Who gave you permission to conduct a full-scale combat operation without orders from headquarters? What have you done there, launched the Vistula-Oder offensive?" And then our poor Karetanov realized he was in trouble. He began to mumble excuses, incoherently reporting that it was just a weapons test, that the soldiers had gone a little overboard. The voice on the radio wouldn't let up, demanding that the fire be stopped immediately. But then Yefremov, with his usual sly look in his eyes, said, Wait. Do you want a helicopter sent to you tomorrow?" "Of course I do," I replied. "I've been asking them for a week for AGS, water, blankets, and at least some mattresses. They promise everything, but nothing comes of it." Yefremov smiled as if he was about to show me a little miracle. Yes, but they won't send water just like that. You have to give them a little push. Now watch and be quiet." He took the tangent, moved it away from his face to the full length of his outstretched arm, pressed the transmit button, and broadcast to the entire gorge. Graphic, this is Summit 12. The batteries are dead. Switching to receive only. He pressed the button. Immediately, the speaker blared. Graphic 12. What's going on there? What's all the shooting? Report the situation. The radio screeched, demanding an answer, but Efremov just winked slyly and shoved the tangent to my ear. Listen, just be quiet. Right now they'll be tearing their hair out, but tomorrow morning you'll have a helicopter, with batteries, water, ammunition, and even explosives. Like in the song, Hydrogen, Give It Back. Haratdinov, hearing all this, closed his eyes and seemed to dissolve into the voice of the colonel, who was yelling into the air. He wasn't even angry. On the contrary, he seemed to derive real aesthetic pleasure from the way the colonel masterfully and fiercely cut off every word. Now that's what I call a commander, he muttered, and we realized that there would definitely be no retreat. Meanwhile, we got seriously carried away. Efremov made a circle with his hand above his head, as if to say, "Start the orchestra," and we got going. We fired everything we had at our disposal. I fired my RPK at the rocks so hard that my ears were ringing. Gubin fired his sniper rifle until smoke came out of the lubrication. The rifle was overheated to death. Azamuth, happy as a child, brought an RPG-7 and fired several 80mm grenades into the gorge. How that enemy ran around like a headless chicken. The rangefinder showed about 1,300 meters, too far for an SVD. Through the scope, he looked like a small, almost a silhouette. Everyone understood. Dragunov's rifle was designed for reliable combat at 600 to 800 meters, but not at such distances. In addition, a treacherous wind was blowing through the gorge. Sometimes it would blow from the side, then change direction, then stir up dust in a whirlwind. The air density varied, and the currents disrupted the trajectory. Even an experienced sniper would most likely not be able to hit the target in such conditions. Therefore, our shots were more of a demonstration than a real threat. But still, the very fact that the enemy was so close and had dared to show himself made everyone on duty nervous. Buzrukov, the poor fellow who lost half his gray hair in this encounter, joked about it for a long time afterward. But we could see in his eyes that the fear ran deep. Bullets like that are remembered for a lifetime. I think if we could have looked into his soul, we would have seen that, at that moment, he had mentally said goodbye to life. When things calmed down a bit, Efremov immediately commanded, "Shabanov, whistle." Without hesitation, Andriuka stuck 2 fingers in his mouth and let out such a piercing, bandit-like whistle that it echoed throughout the gorge. It was a signal. Cease fire. Silence fell instantly. After that, we reorganized our posts. Yefremov explained to Karetinov that sitting in the dugout was foolish. The Real defense was the SPS at the second point, which Gerasimovich and I had built with our own hands. It had the best view, convenient firing sectors, and at least some confidence that a sudden attack could be avoided. Yefremov himself moved over to us, strengthening our positions. Misha Mobile was transferred to the third point to spread the load. And they also organized a fourth position, closer to the area where helicopters usually landed. They put Seryoga Gubin, Misha Baranov, and Andrei Orlov there. Sergei later liked to recall this moment. When we got there to set up the position, the remains of the previous explosion were still lying among the rocks. The smell was awful. Yefremov grimaced and said to the ensign, "Everything needs to be cleaned up at the fourth point. Otherwise, the stench will be so bad that the soldiers will go crazy." The ensign instructed Orlov to clean up the fourth point. Andrei grumbled and made dirty jokes, trying to get out of the task as best he could, but there was nowhere to go. He came to the place where we were sitting, muttered something discontentedly in our direction, tucked the Berta under his arm, and went to clear the debris. He cursed every stone, as if trying to prevent them from gaining power over him. Then, tired, he sat down on a small hill, opened a can of porridge, and arranged a kind of memorial dinner for himself. He ate it in silence and neatly placed the empty cans on the stones around him, as if they were small guard beacons. 5 minutes after this strange procedure, the sound of gunshots was heard. The cans clinked and bounced off the rocks. Orlov cursed and shouted, "Enemies!" and darted behind a rock, instinctively pressing himself to the ground. We looked at each other. It all seemed too deliberate. And indeed, Such pranks with gunshots were repeated 3 times during the day. Either someone was having fun, or they were testing our reaction. Night fell. Gerasimovich and I took our turn on duty as a pair. The wind in the gorge died down, only the rocks gave off the heat they had accumulated during the day. We could hear the occasional crackling of bushes. Efremov, as usual, went to check the posts. He chose his route. First he looked in on Buzz Rukov at the first point, then descended through the rocks and walked along the line to reach the second. He did everything methodically, without haste, as if deliberately showing us an example of how to move correctly in the mountains at night. I sat on my tower and watched. The moon illuminated only part of the rocks, the rest was as dark as oil. And then, out of this darkness, a figure suddenly appeared, the silhouette of a man moving low and cautiously, but still within my firing range. Efremov was approaching from below, his footsteps almost inaudible. The thought immediately flashed through my mind, what to do? According to the regulations, I should call out loudly and clearly, "Halt! Who goes there?" But he warned me that he knew all the soldiers' tricks, a loud shout to the nearest commander to wake up the others. He asked me not to do that. I felt my palms sweating, and in order to show that the sector was under control, I clicked the legs of the machine gun, as if warning him that the weapon was ready. My voice came out low and angry, and I asked quietly into the darkness, "Who are you?" "Lieutenant Baranov." That's how Yefremov introduced himself when he moved away from the dugout and headed in my direction. Only later did he say that in such situations it is better not to click the machine gun legs, but to pull the bolt immediately. He said that this sound instantly makes it clear, the barrel is ready, the cartridge is in the chamber, no more jokes. Of course, I objected that I already had a full load of ammunition in the chamber, 46 cartridges, and if I pulled the trigger, one would immediately fly into the dust. Why make unnecessary wasteful gestures? Efremov just waved his hand and said, "Fine, as you wish, you'll be responsible for your actions." He walked on to check on Orlov. 20 minutes later, he returned, approached the command post, woke me and Gerasimovich from our slumber, and said quietly but firmly, "Everything seems to be normal at the posts." Only Orlov's face is suspiciously calm, like a man who has been sleeping soundly for a long time. I'll give him another half hour. If he doesn't wake up by then, it means he's definitely sleeping on the job. And you too, he pointed at us. Be quiet as the dead. Not a sound. No clicking your heels, no calling out. I'll come back myself and check everything myself. Understood. We stood at attention and replied almost in unison, "Yes, sir." After that, we went our separate ways. Gerasimovich went to his trench, and I climbed into the tower, keeping my eyes wide open out of habit, as if the darkness could hide anyone. Half an hour passed. The silence was so thick that you could hear the wind rustling the sparse bushes somewhere down in the gorge. Suddenly, there was a faint creak from the entrance to the SPS. The flap covering the entrance opened slightly. I turned around at the sound and, instinctively, poked my head out of the tower. At that very moment, I heard an angry, barely audible hiss. Shoo! Yefremov's fist flashed right in front of my nose. He deliberately made it clear, "Keep quiet and don't even think about calling out." I pulled my head back in and froze, rooted to the spot. A few seconds later, the silence was broken by a heavy metallic clang, the sound of a buttstock coming down with full force on something hard. It was the folding buttstock of an automatic rifle hitting Orlov's head. Immediately after the blow, muffled voices were heard behind the rocks. One was swearing and groaning hoarsely, the other, calmer and harsher, was urging him not to make noise. He was asleep, the bastard. Efremov exhaled when he returned and reported his observation. After that, he climbed inside the SPS, and I, without thinking twice, climbed out of my tower and headed across the rocks to Gerasimovich's post. I climbed into the trench, checked my automatic rifle, took off my pea jacket and belt with my dog tag, and, handing it all to Oleg, warned him, "Keep an eye on my stuff and, most importantly, don't shoot me when I come back." I said that and crawled away. Crawling over rocks, as it turned out, was even more convenient than crawling on flat ground. The stones and crevices hid you in the natural folds of the terrain. It felt like you were becoming part of this stone ridge, dissolving into it. But there were also minor, completely unexpected problems. The buttons on his gym shirt. They caught on the ledges and slid across the rock with an unpleasant scratching sound. I would never have thought that a button could give a soldier away. But this time I was lucky. Orlov, as before, slept peacefully, detached from the world, as if the butt of the rifle on his head was not a punishment but a lullaby. And so I crawled up to him. I saw that he was sleeping, leaning against the wall of the SPS. Next to him was a machine gun, neatly placed, but clearly not in combat readiness. I made sure once again that he was cut off from his weapon and made up my mind. I jumped down on top of him. Orlov flinched, jumped up, but it was too late. I turned him with his back to me, put my elbow under his chin and locked him in a hold, simultaneously wrapping my legs around his body. It was a classic chokehold that I had been taught in training. It is incredibly difficult to break free from such a position, and if you are still sleepy and not ready for a fight, you don't stand a chance. I knew he had only 10 seconds. 10 seconds of desperate struggling, after which his consciousness would shut down and his body would go limp. All this time, he was kicking, hitting his heels against the rocks, trying to find the knife. But even if he had the knife in his hand, what good would it do? To strike, you need to turn around, and human arms don't bend backward like an octopus's. The eagle was asleep, and it was obvious. He was completely demoralized, not even understanding what was going on around him. He was still kicking desperately, either trying to break free or simply out of terror. And then something happened that no one expected. His heel struck the wall of his SPS with full force, and the wall turned out to be so flimsy and poorly secured that it slid down the slope. The rocks broke off and fell down, colliding with the basalt and sending sparks flying. I had never thought before that hitting a rock could cause a real fireworks display of sparks, but that night I saw it with my own eyes. The sparks flew down the cliff, and several rocks reached the minefield and hit the alarm. In that instant, it sprang to life. It whistled piercingly, spitting green rockets upward. Flashes lit up the sky, illuminating the gorge. There was complete chaos. I let go of Orlov, he gasped, clutching his neck. "You traitor!" he croaked, barely getting to his feet. His eyes were full of anger and fear, his voice trembled, but he still managed to squeeze out, "Third time in one night." I said very quietly, almost in a whisper, because the ensign and Efremov were already running towards us, and from the fourth point they opened fire in the direction of the wailing siren. Who knows, maybe there really were enemy fighters there. A moment later, Efremov appeared. He jumped out with his machine gun at the ready, tense, his face lit up by green flashes of rockets, casting wild shadows on the rocks. I decided to play it safe and pretend I had nothing to do with it. I scratched the top of my head, trying to look completely idiotic, but in the darkness I stumbled and fell right onto the SPS structure. There was a crash, and the wood and iron collapsed like a house of cards. "Listen, you bunch of idiots!" roared Karetinov, glancing at the destruction illuminated by the green light of the rockets. "Can you be trusted with anything at all?" Neither he nor Efremov even noticed that I was without my jacket, belt, or machine gun. They all looked around, argued, and left, deciding that the alarm and clumsy hands had caused the commotion. Oriol, breathing heavily, managed to utter barely audibly, "Thank you for not turning me in." I told Efremov that I hadn't been sleeping, that I recognized him, and that's why I didn't call out to him. I looked at him silently. "I won't turn you in," he croaked. "I'll punish you myself. I won't let you go a fourth time. If I have to, we'll all suffer because of you someday. The jokes are over." He turned away and staggered off into the darkness. Still feeling his weight on my arms and the sound of the alarm in my ears, I went to Gerasimovich to get my clothes and weapons. The enemies had returned, and this was no longer a joke.